In this lesson, we're going to look at how to work with text in Adobe Flash. And in our toolbox, we have the text tool. I'm going to select that. And in the properties, we have a couple of drop downs at the top. And the first one has two options as far as a broader category of text. One is TLF text and the other is classic text. TLF text was introduced, I think it was version CS5 and continues in CS6, but it's been deprecated in future versions going forward, including Adobe Flash Creative Cloud or Flash CC. So therefore I'm going to focus on the classic text, and we'll come back and I'll just look a little bit at TLF text for those who are using CS5, CS6. But to be honest, TLF text was not implemented well. It had some issues, and that's one of the reasons they deprecated it. One of the advantages of TLF text, or why it was introduced, was it did allow text flow from right to left for other fonts besides English fonts, such as Chinese and or Hebrew. And one of the cool features for TLF text was we could flow text from one block to another block. It supposedly also had better printing capabilities, but for most of our projects, at least here in the United States, we don't need text that flows from right to left, and Flash is more digitally read than used as a print medium. And so really the only feature that I found useful in terms of TLF text in the projects that I do was to be able to flow from one column to another column. And even that was rare that I used that. And it was primarily useful when I was reading external text file in and wanted to flow things around an image or so forth. So I'm perfectly happy with just classic text, and even going through CS5 and CS6, I always told my students, use classic text unless you absolutely have to use TLF text. So with that, I'm going to choose classic text, and there are then three options of classic text. One is static text, then dynamic text, and input text, and we'll look at all three. We're going to start with static text. Static text is text that doesn't change. You can think of it almost as graphical text. In the properties panel, we have a character grouping, and I can choose a font. Right now I have Arial, but I could click the drop down arrow here and choose another font. I have a style, and within the Arial family there's a bunch of different styles. This will be context sensitive for the font that's chosen. Some fonts may only have a regular style. There's a size option, and I can either click and type in that, or I can use my scrubby sliders and enlarge or reduce the size by using the mouse and scrubbing through that scrubby slider. I'm going to set it back at 18. Letter spacing is spacing between words. You might think of it as tracking. And then I can choose a color. Right now I have black, but I could choose a different color if I wanted. And then auto-kern, there's a checkbox, and auto-kern is the spacing between certain pairs of letters, such as an A and W, that can be brought a little bit tighter because of the slants of those characters aside each other. Anti-aliasing allows us to soften the curves of text, and there are different ways of looking at anti-aliasing, different algorithms, and the two that I would probably use the most would be for animation or for readability, and probably using readability more than anything. And then we have a couple other options here. I can make the text selectable if I want. And then next to that, I can render it as HTML, and I can also put a border around it. Those two options are grayed out when we're working with static text. And then I can also set text to be either superscript or subscript here. And we'll come back and look at some of the styles that are available to us a little bit later. So I've got my text tool loaded for static text, Arial regular 18 point. I'm just going to click on my stage, and I can then begin to type what I want. You'll notice that my text box expands as I type. And if I want to wrap down to the next line, I can press the Enter key. Now, in the upper right-hand corner of our text box is a little circle, and that little circle is telling me that this was a text box that was created with no defined width. I can grab that and drag it and resize the width. Notice that little circle now turned into a square. So this is a defined width. I can always come back and change that width anytime I want. Now, since I put a hard carriage return in here, I might need to come back and get rid of that. The other option is I can define a box to begin with by dragging and creating a size for the box. And now as I type, you'll notice it automatically wraps. And you'll notice I get the little square here to begin with because I defined the width of that text box, and I always come back and redefine that. If I want to change the color of text box, I can always come back, select it, and I can come in here and change the color. And I can also always come back and select the text, change the style, and I can even select text and change the color of just that text for static text. So I'm changing just one word. I can even come back and select some text. Let's just do all good men. And if I wanted, I could make that larger and change the style. With the selection tool, I can select a text box, drag and move it. I'm going to select the text box. I can have that text centered, I can write a line, and I can justify it. I can change the spacing in terms of the indent of the first line of the paragraph. I can change the spacing of the lines, or we might refer to as leading. I can adjust the margin, and I can adjust the right margin. Set that back to 0. I can also come in and select some text. I'm going to take the text tool, and I can highlight some text. I'm going to choose the aid, and I'm going to provide a link. My link here is going to be http://www.redcross.org. So I can provide a link, and then I can choose the target. Now, this is really going back to primarily using Flash in a web browser, and so I have some options as to how I want it to react in that web browser. I can bring up a new browser page, which would be blank. I can bring it up in the parent page, or in the current page, which would be self, or if I'm several levels deep, I can go to the top page. Usually I choose blank, and primarily as I create apps that might be running in on an Android device or an iPad, by choosing blank, it's simply going to bring up your web browser and go to that website. Let's just try this for a minute. I'm going to run my application. And it doesn't underline the text like it does in a lot of editors for static text. But as I point to it, I get the little hand, and I can click on it, and it brings up the web page. I'm going to take my selection tool and simply delete both of those, and I'm going to create another static text. This one's going to be, I'll use a blue color. I'll make this a little bit larger. Let's go 40-point font. And I'm going to set this for Arial Black. It's a little bit bolder. So I've got this text box. We've already seen this in a previous lesson, but I can select this text box, go to the Modify menu, and choose Break Apart, and now each letter is an individual text box. And I can do things like take the free transform tool and angle different letters. I can then select all that if I wanted and choose break apart again. And now this is simply graphics, it's shapes. So I've turned each letter into its own individual shape. And one thing that's kind of cool with that, I'm going to zoom in here, is I can click on this shape, take the sub-selection tool, and I can begin to manipulate this. I could also use the selection tool and maybe want to have kind of some rounded tops. So I can manipulate these just like I would any other shape. Zoom back out. And again, I'm going to get rid of all that. Dynamic text is text that can change. So here I'm going to take dynamic text. I'm going to draw a box. I'll type in SMCC. And I'll take my selection tool. I'm going to move this over here. This is dynamic text, and it can be changed in code. So if I want to change this, I need to give it an instance name if I'm going to refer to it in code, just like we did previous with buttons. So I'm going to just call this output underscore txt. All the other character and paragraph rules can pertain to dynamic text. One additional thing, there is an embed button here, and you should always take your text and embed it. Now there's several options in terms of what character ranges we want to embed. The temptation may be to choose all, but as we go through the list, that is going to include all these other character sets, including Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Latin, Greek, Cyrillic, Hebrew. In most cases, we don't need all that. So what I normally do is I usually choose uppercase, lowercase, numerals, and punctuation. Regardless of what kind of text or what the contents are going to be of that text box, I usually choose all four of those. If I know it's strictly going to be numbers, I can choose just numerals, but adding in lowercase, uppercase, and punctuation really doesn't add that much more to the size of your document. So when I don't have the text box selected, I do get a dotted border around it for dynamic text. And if I wanted, one of the options for that text box now is I can choose to put a border around it. The next type of text is input text. This is text that the user can enter information into. And I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. So I'm going to type the phrase South Mountain. Now if this was a different font, I'd want to embed my input text font as well. And again, I can choose to have a border around it or not. For my dynamic text, I can also make it selectable. The user could select it. They can't replace it, but they can copy it and paste it, say, into a word processor. I'm going to take my text tool again. This time I want some static text. I'm going to create a little button, and my button's just simply going to say go. And I'm going to right click on this. Actually, let's go ahead and add a rectangle. So now I'm going to select that, turn it into a button. I'm going to call it BTN Go. I'm going to place that there. I'm going to give this an instance name. We'll call it Go underscore BTN. And then I'm going to bring up my timeline. I'm going to add another layer for actions. I'm going to right click, bring up my actions. We'll create our event listener, Go underscore BTN. Add event listener. mouse event dot click. I'm going to have a function called get input. I need to write that function. And I'm going to create a variable. I'm just going to call it XYZ, which is going to be of a string data type. It's going to equal input underscore txt.text. Now I haven't created or named my input text box yet, but that's going to be the name of it. Input underscore txt. I want to get the text property of that. And then I want to say output underscore txt.text, which is our dynamic text box, equals XYZ. So I'm going to select my input text box, give it an instance name of input underscore txt. And then let's test our movie. So now when I click the Go button, it takes the text from the input text box and puts it in the output text box. I can change this. So I can get input from the user. I cannot change the dynamic text box, or the user cannot change it. It can only be changed in code. So that's the difference between the three types of text: static, dynamic, and input. If you're creating buttons, you should always use static text for your captions of the buttons. So one other thing to be aware of on text, I'm going to scroll up a little bit here, is I'm going to set a dynamic text box. And I'm going to get a little bit smaller font here, say 20 point. I'm going to deselect this. I'm going to turn the, I'll leave the border on so you can see the text box. Move it down. There is an option in the properties for this dynamic text box of behavior. And right now I have multi-line. I can also choose multi-line no wrap, which means I can have multiple lines, but the text isn't going to wrap unless I press the Enter key. And I can also choose single line. So when I choose single line, it's not going to wrap for me, although as I edit this text box, it'll wrap so I can see the text, but as soon as I deselect the text box, I don't see the multiple lines. So if you want your text to wrap, be sure to choose multi-line. I can also apply a filter to this text. I can add a filter. Maybe I want to have a drop shadow to the text. Now in this case it's doing it to the text box. If I turn the border off, it'll do it to the text. Now let's just take a quick look at TLF Text. In our Properties panel with the Text tool, we had TLF and Classic Text, and I've got TLF selected here. And then there are three choices. Just like we had in the Classic option, there was static, dynamic, and input. Correspondingly, in the TLF Text, we have read-only, selectable, and editable. So we can think of read-only as static, selectable as dynamic, and editable as input. So I have an application here in which I have a TLF read-only text box, that's static text, and then I have a selectable text box which contains the first paragraph from The Hound of the Baskervilles, the Sherlock Holmes tale. And notice that the text actually is more than what shows up in that window. And then I have a second selectable TLF box. So here for me was the real value of TLF text, and that was to be able to flow text from one box to another. So I'm going to take this and just simply, I'm going to scroll up even a little bit more. And so my text doesn't all appear up here in this box. There is more that follows after that. And in TLF Text, there is a little linking box here that I could actually click on. And when I do that, it loads my mouse pointer with remaining text, and I can go over to this text box and click it, and the text flows, and notice it creates a link between the two. If I were to take this text box and maybe expand this up, you'll notice that the text automatically reflows between those two text boxes. That to me was the value of TLF Text. It's been deprecated in Flash CC, so this option is no longer available moving forward.